Chapter 18, Section 4, America as a World Power. President Theodore Roosevelt was unwilling to allow the imperial powers of Europe to control the world's politics and economic destiny. And in 1905, building on those open door notes of John Hay to increase American influence in East Asia, Roosevelt mediated a settlement in a war between Russia and Japan. So what role did President Roosevelt play in ending what was called the Russo-Japanese War? Well, first of all, understand a little bit of background. Russia and Japan were both imperialist powers, and they were really competing for power, or competing for control of Korea. The Japanese kind of take the first action in this war with a surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet. As the war progresses, Japan really has the upper hand and is very successful in defeating the Russians. But as a result of a lot of these battles, Japan began to run out of men and money, a fact that they really didn't want to reveal to Russia. So Japanese officials approached President Roosevelt in secret to ask him to mediate peace negotiations. These negotiations will eventually take place in the United States in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and will become known as the Treaty of Portsmouth. But the successful efforts of Teddy Roosevelt in negotiating the Treaty of Portsmouth will eventually end up helping him win the 1906 Nobel Peace Prize. So what events led to the building of the Panama Canal? Well, as a result of the Spanish-American War, the new American empire stretched from Puerto Rico in the Caribbean to the Philippines in the Pacific. As a strategic necessity for holding on to these far-flung islands, the United States desired a canal through Central America to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. However, building a canal would be extremely difficult. You see, the French had already tried and failed to complete this canal through the tropic jungles of Panama. And before the United States could even try, it needed to negotiate an agreement with Great Britain to cancel an earlier treaty known as the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, in which any canal in Central America was to be under a joint British-United States control. So in 1901, mostly because the United States had been kind of helpful to Great Britain was in a mood to give up that right and allow the United States exclusive rights to build and defend this canal. That would become known as the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty. And again, signed in 1901, giving the United States exclusive rights to build and defend this canal. Well, President Roosevelt takes charge, and so he's very eager to begin the construction of a canal. Ideally, they were looking at, first of all, Nicaragua, but the French are going to convince us to kind of buy their company, and we will resume France's effort of building a canal in Panama. The only problem is Roosevelt is somewhat frustrated because Colombia has control of Panama and that isthmus. And even though the United States had offered a boatload of money to Colombia to be able to continue digging the canal, Colombia refused and demanded more money and even sovereignty over the canal. Roosevelt was in no mood to put up with that. And so he's going to really kind of support the orchestration of a revolt in Panama for Panama to gain its independence from Colombia already in 1903. And so with the help of this French leader of the French company, canal company, his name was Philip Benau Varilla, he'll help organize a rebellion, Panama versus Colombia, right? With the support of the U.S. Navy, the rebellion succeeded, and immediately the United States government will accept Panama as an independent country. And Panama and the United States then sign a treaty which gives the United States all rights over the 51-mile long and 10-mile wide canal zone, as if it were the sovereign of that territory. And again, the United States would also be able to protect it, which is a kind of a reason why a lot of those Latin American countries are kind of important for the United States to kind of have, you might say, an occupation there. This treaty is known as the Hay-Benau-Varilla Treaty. And again, in that treaty, they'll pay Panama $10 million and an annual rent of $250,000 for that land across Panama, called the Canal Zone. On this slide, you just have what I think are some really cool pictures of the Panama Canal. At the top of the slide, top left, you have the Atlantic Ocean, and the bottom right, you have the Pacific Ocean. And if you're wondering what that little black line is, that is, you might say, a transcontinental railroad. And it goes through some pretty sketchy areas. And there was always a problem of it really breaking down and things like that. But it was still, prior to the Panama Canal, that was how you got from one side of the Atlantic to the Pacific a lot faster. Obviously, if you look at kind of the middle left, there's a picture there that kind of shows you, you might say, a cross section of the elevation. And you can see that France, when they were going to build it, they were just going to go straight through, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. That was where they ran into really big problems. The United States ends up, if you notice, there are like little steps into the ground going up to the very top there. That's what the canal is. It pushes water up or takes water out, raising or lowering a boat in that lock. That's why they were called a lock and dam system. So we continue with Roosevelt and the world. We're going to take a look at what was called the Roosevelt Corollary state, sometimes referred to as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So another application of what's sometimes referred to as Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. And if you're not sure, if you look at the little cartoon there, he's got this big club in his hand. So if you're not sure what that usually is referring to, that usually is a reference to Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy. Here he kind of takes on the motto, speak softly and carry a big stick. When he said that, the American press kind of applied the label big stick to his foreign policy. And so Teddy Roosevelt becomes known, his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is kind of his big stick policy. And another application of his big stick diplomacy involved Latin American nations that were extremely deep in financial trouble and couldn't pay their debts to a lot of their European creditors. So rather than let Europeans intervene in Latin America, which was to Americans was a blatant violation of the Monroe Doctrine back in 1823, Roosevelt declared that the United States would intervene instead. whenever necessary. And so that policy became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It meant that the United States would send gunboats to a Latin American country that was delinquent in paying its debts to one of those other countries. And US sailors and Marines would then occupy the country's major ports and manage all of the collection of their custom taxes until their European debt was completely satisfied. So really simple. The United States would basically kind of take over and help make sure you could pay your debt back. So we were going to intervene for you. Over the next 20 years, US presidents will use Roosevelt's corollary to justify sending US forces into countries like Haiti, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, and even Nicaragua. One long-term result of such intervention like this turns out to be a very poor relation with almost the entire region of Latin America. So that was Roosevelt's corollary state. This doesn't have anything to do really with Teddy Roosevelt, except Roosevelt handpicks his successor, which happens to be, if you look at the big guy in that cartoon there, William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft doesn't carry a big stick. In fact, in the cartoon, he's putting it on the mantle above the fireplace. William Howard Taft adopts a foreign policy that was more mildly expansionist, but it depended more on investors' dollars than on Navy battleships. That's why you see in the letter A there, substituted dollars for bullets. His policy of promoting U.S. trade by supporting American enterprises in other countries, that was known as dollar diplomacy. It does, in letter B, it does say, especially in the Caribbean, increasing American investment in Latin America. This is also going to include investments in Asia as well, such as China and Japan and the Philippines. Again, Taft believed that private American financial investment in China and Central America would lead to greater stability there, while at the same time promoting U.S. business interests. He thought it was a win-win for those other countries like China or Latin America, and of course, American investors. His policy, though, is going to be kind of thwarted by one major obstacle. The United States, there's a growing anti-imperialism sector here in the United States and overseas. And the other is that Woodrow Wilson doesn't like it when he becomes president. And so he cuts off all the funding. That brings us to Woodrow Wilson and what's called his missionary diplomacy. And so when we talk about that, we sometimes refer to his missionary diplomacy as also a moral diplomacy. So what was that missionary diplomacy? Well, it's placing a more moral tone to the Monroe Doctrine. Basically stating that now the United States had a more moral responsibility to deny recognition to any Latin American government it viewed as oppressive or undemocratic or even hostile to U.S. interests. So support, and mostly this is going to be financial support, is really going to be given only to countries whose moral beliefs are similar to the United States. This really puts pressure on nations, and especially in the Western Hemisphere, to establish democratic governments and choose very good leaders, again, especially in Latin America. And it's really a revolution in Mexico that will really put Wilson's policy to the test. So real quickly, let's kind of explain a little bit about Mexico's revolution here, because it is rather important. Mexico had been ruled for quite some time prior to all this by a military dictator by the name of Diaz. Diaz was a friend to the United States and even encouraged foreign investment into his country, especially the United States. And as a result of this, a lot of Americans actually owned large shares of Mexican oil, mines, railroads, and ranches. In fact, one of the, I think it was Pulitzer, had a ranch that was about the size of Rhode Island. He owned that in Mexico. And as things got bad, this revolution breaks out, he'll put pressure on Wilson to send military help there to protect his land ownership. Well, in about 1911, a guy by the name of Francisco Madero is going to overthrow Diaz. He makes a lot of promises for major reforms, but after about 2 years, a guy by the name of General Victoriano Huerta is going to take over the government. And interestingly, within a few days, Madero is murdered. And because of this suspicion that Huerta was behind that, Wilson refuses to recognize Huerta's government. And again, one of the reasons we talk about a moral diplomacy, they need to choose good leaders. He did not see Huerta as good leaders. And so you've got two, you might say, revolutionaries out on the fringes here as Huerta takes over, and that's Carranza and Pancho Villa. There are going to be some issues between the United States and Mexico during Huerta's reign in Mexico. One will be where a number of American sailors end up being arrested in a place called Tampico, which is on Mexico's eastern shore. And Wilson's going to use that incident to excuse military intervention in Mexico and orders Marines to occupy the port city Veracruz, which happens to be a very important Mexican port. And he also justifies that by saying that was going to stop Germany from providing Huerta with military weapons, because since Wilson didn't support Huerta got no aid, military or financial, from the United States, and so he had to look other places for it. Well, Huerta, his reign regime soon collapses, and Carranza takes over, becoming president in 1915. And of course, Wilson recognizes Carranza's government, which kind of leaves Pancho Villa a little upset that he wasn't recognized. Pancho Villa is going to end up threatening the United States in a couple of ways. One, he's going to end up killing a number of engineers, American engineers that were on their way to help in Mexico. And Villa will then, with his little posse, head into New Mexico and kill 17 Americans there. And it's at that point Wilson sends in the U.S. military under the leadership of General John Pershing. Pershing is going to pursue throughout Mexico Pancho Villa. He will never capture him. He'll eventually run into some of Carranza's troops, and almost at a point where it looks like the United States and Mexico are going to go to war, World War I breaks out in Europe, and Wilson orders Pershing to return home. The United States pursued and achieved I guess I should have flipped that over sooner, but hopefully a lot of the stuff that you just heard on the previous slide is actually what's on this slide. So the United States pursued and achieved several foreign policy goals in the early 20th century. First, it expanded its access to foreign markets in order to ensure the continued growth of the domestic economy. Second, the United States built a modern navy to protect its interests abroad. And third, the United States exercised its international police power to ensure its dominance in Latin America, to protect its interests there, American investment there, as well as protecting the Panama Canal there. So that ends our discussion of Chapter 18. If you have any questions, make sure you email me those.